Next, the lesson goes into talking about views. And before we really talk about views, it's necessary to understand what a table is. Now, if you've worked with Microsoft Access before, you get a good idea of what a table is. And in database terms, a table is just a collection of both rows and columns that is used to organize information about a single topic. Now, each row within a table corresponds to a single record and contains several attributes that describe that row. And above all, tables are the basic building block of all relational databases. Now once we have that, let's talk about views. Now a view is essentially a virtual table with columns derived from a table or tables and stored as a query. Views are used for security and providing an alternative logical view of the database structure. Now, an important benefit of using views is that views can be used to represent a summation of data. As you can see here, unlike a table, a view is stored in the database as a query object. Therefore, a view is an object that contains its data from other tables. So users can't modify that. That way the data is protected. Now here's a view from a Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio in which you can see where your views are stored. You can see here in your tree structure that you have an area for views. We have various system views that are available and various options here. So I just wanted you to get a feel for when you're using the SSMS that here is what you would look for there on the left side in your Object Explorer view there in the SSMS. Now we'll move on to our stored procedures. Now stored procedure, as you can see here, is just a previously written SQL statement which has been stored or saved into the database. One way to take this a little bit further is that a stored procedure is a group of TSQL or transact SQL statements that have been compiled and saved so it can be run several times. Now we'll take a look at one of these. This is just pretty simple, just a SQL statement that you've already created so you can reuse it again rather than starting from scratch. And sometimes you'll find it necessary that you need to run that same query over and over again, based on requests that you get. So if you can, once you create that and execute it, store it so that when you need to execute it again, you already have it saved, and you're not only saving yourself time, but you're saving the customer time, and because you're not having to start from scratch. And when you're creating these stored procedures, make sure that you're documenting them well so that in case you move on or you need to train someone, it's very simple to explain it, and the next person that takes a look at that or uses that will have, a clear understanding of what that stored procedure was there for. Now I want to briefly talk about SQL injection. Now, an SQL injection is an attack in which malicious code is inserted into strings which are then later on passed to different instances of SQL Server waiting for parsing and execution. Now, any procedure that constructs SQL statements should be reviewed continually for these type of injection vulnerabilities because SQL Server will execute all syntactically valid queries from any source. So we want to make sure that we validate these before those are executed. So the primary form of SQL injection is a direct insertion of code into user input variables that are concatenated with SQL commands and then they're executed. Now a less direct method of attack injects this malicious code into strings that are designed for storage in a table and are considered, you probably heard this term before, metadata. Now when these stored strings are subsequently concatenated into the dynamic SQL command, the malicious code will then be executed. Primarily for the MTA 98-364 exam, all you really need to know is that SQL injection is an attack in which malicious code is inserted into strings that are later passed on to instances of SQL Server for parsing and execution in the database. Now we've talked about data types and stored procedures and different things like that. Well, in our SQL statements and the stored procedures, well, last thing I want to talk about is as you are creating all this information, it's very important to use good naming conventions for your objects. Now we have really two main naming conventions for objects in databases and pretty much in the IT world, and that's Pascal case and camel case. Now with Pascal case, the first letter of the identifier and the first letter of each subsequent concatenated word is capitalized. So you would let's say you were calling it uh, employee table. You would have the E in employee and the T in table capitalized. That's Pascal case. The first letter of the identifier and the first letter of each subsequent concatenated word is capitalized. Now, the other case that we use is camel case. Now, this is where the first letter of the identifier is lowercase and the first letter of each subsequent concatenated word is capitalized. So, if we were using employee table again as our example, we would have employee all in lowercase letters, and then when we got to table, we would capitalize the T in table. So we'd have employee, capital T, able. That would be an example of camel case. Now once you pick a naming convention, make sure to use it consistently throughout your database environment, just so that you have that consistency and you've maintained your database in a form that anyone that looks at that one object knows how to name an object if they create an object. So let's just stay consistent when we're working with their databases. Thank you everyone for joining me with Lesson 2 on creating database objects.